much for the opportunity to speak at this event, partly as a result of the fact that we would like to market our water archive, but also getting the opportunity to speak to a very scientifically and technologically literate community. I'm just a historian, but I'm a bit of a hybrid. Sometimes I'm a philosopher, sometimes I'm a hydrologist. You know, I have a bit of an identity crisis because I work in transdisciplinary methodologies and I enjoy the adventure. I'm going to share with you an interpretation of South African history with a specific focus on the WF Nexus. I'm looking at the period 1910 to 2008. The reason why I did not incorporate the period after 2008 is because we had a very definitive regime change in South Africa that I think was very difficult to interpret. At the time when I was writing in 2016, 2017, therefore I thought, well, that would probably be a WF Nexus project that I can take up with the view of going up to 2019. Ladies and gentlemen, just to give you a view of my point of departure, I work in the context of the WF Nexus. I use resilience theory, and specifically I work on Gunderson and Holling's conception of panarchy. And then also I use the hydraulic mission conception as a sort of pointer to stages and phases of water governance in South Africa. Now, the WF Nexus is a very smart term, but I read some of the recent literature, and that what was more explicit for me was the issue of a resources nexus. And based on that, I also read Allen in some of his recent writings. He has ventured into talking about sub-nexuses. For example, you have water, energy, and you have mining as a sub-nexus. So you have replaceable resources that you face, and you can incorporate that in your thinking. Now, please just have a look at the triangular mode of water, energy, and food, and you will see that I will integrate it when we get to the panarchy phase. The nexus, we're talking a lot about nexus. Do you know that it comes from Greek? Aristotle used it already, and it was A.N. Whitehead, a mathematician and philosopher who immigrated from Britain to the United States, and in 1926, in an effort to help economic planning in the USA, started thinking about process philosophy. Now, the WEF itself, it was promoted by the World Economic Forum in 2008, and from there on, Germany took the lead in 2011 prior to the next World Summit, World Earth Summit, and they made a substantial contribution to promoting the concept of the WEF. Right, please, this is panarchy. It works in terms of the infinity symbol, And what appealed to me way back in 2011 about panarchy and resilience thinking is the fact that remember comes into the copper phase of the cycle. And I'm a historian. I love hermeneutics. That's my way of thinking. It's qualitative. And I'm thinking of historical consciousness and our need to have a memory. And the fact that you move from an A phase and alpha phase to a kappa phase by remembering, you can build on the future and you can expand what you have. Whereas if you move from the K phase, the kappa phase, into the omega phase at the bottom there, it implies that you collapse. And then you have a revolt in the system. So we are working with a very dynamic system. It's very unpredictable, but it is, they say it's natural science. For me, it's human science, but I love this strategy for thinking. So it shapes my basic thinking about water and the long-term cycles we've experienced. Now, I use the hydraulic mission as a principle for classifying the different periods of the evolution of South Africa's WF Nexus. And Karl Wittfogel was responsible for defining the concept. It was controversial, but in essence, the hydraulic mission is the manner in which a governance authority chooses to prioritize the use of its water resources. Now, a conventional way of looking at the historical development of water governance in South Africa is by looking at the different pieces of legislation that were introduced since the start of the 20th century. I chose to steer clear of that because I'm taking note of significant disruptors, and the food component of the nexus was the first to emerge, and that was already in 1912. The next phase was the energy phase. That started in 1942, and then, let's say, the water phase really started in 1994. You can maybe take it to 1990, but those are, let's say, conspicuous dates that I have selected in order to get to somewhat of a different approach to what happened to us. Now, if you just think, let's have a look at the irrigation nexus. In South Africa, 1910 marked the start of the Union of South Africa. A number of British colonies and former Afrikaner republics united. And also some African polities were incorporated into what was South Africa. Irrigation at the time, modern irrigation from the USA, new technology, was something like a game changer. For South Africa's farming sector, it brought significant progress. We made a number of breakthroughs, and it improved our export market. And the government department responsible for driving or governing the water supplies was called the Department of Irrigation. So the primary focus was providing water and conserving the waters in the interest of food. And you can describe that as basically identifying the environmental affordances. Where water is, you will be able to start irrigation, and that is a psychological process that starts kicking in when you start operating as a planner. And some of the accomplishments of the period was that we find that in the era of World War I, South Africa linked up with the rest of the world, and shortly after that we finished Lake Mens. That was one of the first large dams in South Africa, major dams. And then right after World War I, we also had a post-war depression. Now, if you just think about what was happening at the time, as early as 1916, Smuts and Botha, the Prime Minister, and his sidekick, they were thinking about starting an Eskom. And that only materialized in 1922 at the time of the Rand strike, that Eskom came into existence. So there were a number of drivers of a potential industrial revolution in South Africa, but it was not an energy industrial revolution, but it was not yet quite the time for it. There you find an example of modern dam construction, a private sector initiative. That is the Smart Syndicate Dam in 1920. They primarily used manual labor, but that was primarily the private sector. That was also in the Kalahari. And this was Lake Mentz, the first public sector major dam project where they used mechanized tools for construction. So think about energy, think about large dam construction, then you get an idea of what we are talking about, what the accomplishment was. But interestingly, at the time, they mostly used second-hand tools because they could not import new tools for this massive dam construction after the Second World War. Right, another major dam project in South Africa is close to where we are now at Hartbeespoort Dam. That started 1912, 1914, but as a result of politics could not get off the ground. It was completed in 1925 with the objective of providing poor whites with opportunities of becoming potential farmers. Also, it was a semi-multi-purpose dam scheme with the objective of eventually also providing water to Pretoria. Now, the post-World War I depression brought about industrial development, but it was an intermittent process. Politically, things changed. In 1924, the PACT government came into power. The Nationalist Party and also the Labour Party joined forces and they took over government, and you had somewhat of a socialist mind frame emerging, but also Afrikaner nationalism emerging very prominently. We were globalized at the time because you had the first Carnegie Commission that brought out its report. And that was a blueprint that was developed in the United States, because in the American South they had problems dealing with poor whites. What do we make with these poor whites in the South? And they looked at the South African example, and there was an educationist, Malherbe. He came from the University of Cape Town. He planted the idea, and subsequently it was a project that South Africa took up at the University of Stellenbosch, and it was possible to deal with the problem of the poor whites, accommodating them in the system. But even more, we looked at the Americans, especially the New Deal of Roosevelt. At the time of the worldwide depression, 1930 to 1933, the New Deal was all about getting people back to work. And they started with dam constructions and also irrigation projects. So at that time, South Africa had a benchmark to work from, and that enabled us to embark on our second golden period of dam construction. That was between 1929 and 1938, until the outbreak of World War II. Now, interestingly, not far from here, you have the Marico-Bosveld Dam under construction, and the photo is a little bad, but if you look at it close up, it's all white working on the dam, doing the manual labor. And from that group of whites, they selected the people with the most potential and turned them into irrigation farmers. They also, in their part-time, had the opportunity to study further. They could learn trades. They were given many opportunities, working under semi-coerced circumstances on developing South Africa's water infrastructure at a very reasonable cost for the state. This is the Vaal Dam, under construction in 1933. It was completed in 1938, the first phase. That was a multi-purpose dam. The Vaal Dam's water provided the SAWHAR's irrigation scheme 300 kilometers downstream with water. The SAWHAR's irrigation scheme still remains one of the largest irrigation schemes in the southern hemisphere, and the bulk of the Vaal Dam's water eventually started moving to the Witwatersrand, where they started driving the industrial hub of South Africa. Right, now the industrial energy hydraulic mission actually started around about 1942, although there are some people who say it was earlier. That was after the Second World War started, but in 1942, the first South African multi-purpose water transfer scheme was introduced at Saldanha Bay. It was a multi-purpose scheme to transfer water for industrial, for domestic, and for government services as well as farming purposes. And the Smuts government in the years of the Second World War was very passionate about driving industrialization, and it was in this period that planning for the CSIR started. And the CSIR would at one stage become, let's say, the Nestor or the guardian of scientific knowledge on South Africa's water. And I think they're still doing a very good job. Right, now what happens in this period is we find that the energy, the growing need for energy broadens the platform for water consumers. Between 1947 and 1956, we find that the water of the Vaal River, remember we said it was originally for the SAWHAR scheme and for Johannesburg or the Witwatersrand. Now, as of 1947, 1949, actually, the water was also sent to the Northern Free State where the Welkom gold fields were started. By 1956, they were in production and the irrigation farmers started getting less water. In this period, after World War II, we find in 1956 we have the National Water Act passed, but it was also the era of African decolonization. In 1948, we had the United Nations Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and in that period, we find in 1955 the Freedom Charter being passed in Johannesburg. 1960, you had Sharpeville, and these are typical collapse events in the political panarchy of South Africa, whereas probably in terms of energy output, we were upwards mobile, as well as the water production unit of the WW1 Nexus, we were also upwards. And the energy demand increased for urban growth and development. And then in 1958, we had our first serious drought situation that started. It lasted until about 1966, and that was a wake-up call, because we were under the impression if we build sufficient large dams, we won't have problems in urban areas with water. And Rand Water, for one, it was the Rand Water Board then, they had their first time that they had to introduce water restrictions. But it was also a wonderful time for hydropower. And you know, conspicuous consumption was very much alive in southern Africa at the time. In 1960, Rhodesia, southern Rhodesia, completed the Kariba Dam, and planning started on the Kobora Basso Dam. And South Africa could not be out of this picture. So what happened was we started working on the Orange River Development Project. And that was between 1962 and 1978. And it was one of the major projects to provide Central South Africa with water, but also make a substantial contribution to our first foray into the field of hydropower.